Welcome to part 3 of Mathematics Through Induction. If you haven't seen the second video, or the first, make sure you go back, or the 0th video. You should really watch these videos in order. Only then will the logical progression of each video make sense to you. So, we're now following the progression of the people of Babylon, who have just figured out agriculture, and so they've been able to settle down into this village between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And they've begun to trade things with one another. Now, and the assignment I gave you last time was to understand, now that they understand quantitative comparison and counting, what sort of things are still hazy to them? And one of those things will be demonstrated in this story. Let's take Ram, who's a fur trader who lives kind of out in the outskirts of Babylon. But what he does is he traps animals, skins them for their furs, and he trades them in town. He sells people furs that they need for the necessities he needs for him and his family. Now, this is kind of rough for him, though, because he always kind of has to get a visual picture of how much, bread and rice and water and stuff like that he needs from town to trade with other people. He kind of has to look at it and say, like, I don't know, I guess that'll be enough for my family for the next few days. It's not very exact, right? So he needs a way to be able to carry the quantity with him. Now, if he uses counting stones, he runs into the same problem, right? Because he just looks at a handful of stones and it's the same thing. Like, oh, well, if these stones represent bread, I guess that looks like enough. He's running into the same problem, right? So what he decides to do is he decides to scratch in the mud one mark for every, say, piece of bread he has for him and his family. And then he scratches a mark for how many pieces of bread he knows his family, eats in a day. And so he looks at that and he says, well, I don't know, that doesn't really help me because, again, these marks, I have the same problem. If I'm trying to keep track of a number of things, I have the same problem. My brain, they wouldn't say it this way, but if I look at this many marks, that's no better than just looking at the bread themselves. But then he comes up with an idea. Every time he has a handful of bread, this many bread, or they now have a word for it, whenever he has 5 bread, he'll mark those and he'll make that into a unit. See? He'll make that into a unit. And so after a while he says, like, okay, I have 5 groups of 5 bread. He's now able to actually record the quantity in the ground. So he's able to, maybe he'll have a specific patch of dirt near his home that's on the outskirts of town. He'll have a specific patch of dirt where he keeps track of all of his supplies. So he knows, oh man, we're almost out of bread. I need to pick up bread, or whatever else they're trading, whatever else he's trading in order to provide for his family. So what this does is, by compressing 5 units into 1 unit, it takes it a little easier on that small little brain of ours, right? He's able to see, okay, it's 5 groups of 5. And the way he does this is when he makes this symbol, this is the tally symbol, right? That symbol with the slash across stands in 1-to-1 correspondence with 5 objects, in the same way that stones used to stand in 1-to-1 correspondence with single objects that we're trying to keep track of. Or words during counting stands in 1-to-1 correspondence with single objects. So we use this compression technique. Ram has realized that if you can make a single symbol that accounts for 5 objects, and then you just have to account for the number of those symbols, and you're able to differentiate between higher and higher numbers. Before, when you look at these units, you can remember it's the same limit, right? You can only really differentiate between maybe 5 and 6 things, 6 and 7 if you're, lucky. For me, it's like 4. Probably because we have all of these compression techniques. I just haven't gotten used to the idea of having to keep track of lots of things in my head. I'm out of practice. So anyway, maybe, he keeps track of, he can only keep track of, maybe Ram's particular brain can only keep track of about 6 things, let's say. Well, before he can only keep track of 6 marks, but now he can keep track of 30. He can really differentiate between anything between 1 and 30, because 30 looks like this. And 25 looks like this. And then something in between looks like this. It's like, okay, I have 5 groups of 5 and then 2 extra. He's able to keep track of that. He's able to go one at a time because we've reduced 5 units to 1 unit using a new concept, this tally symbol. And so this is the method of numerals, writing down symbols that are able to account for units or groups of units. Now, as we move on to the next generalization, we'll be able to use numerals to even greater effect. So your assignment for the next section is to try and come up with a system that is able to enumerate or write down even higher quantities. I bet you can come up with one. And by the way, you don't need to invent one. You can just, if you happen to remember one from maybe your early schooling days, you can use that one too. Or maybe just make up your own and see how it compares to the one that Rom is about to come up with in our next video. I'll see you then.